Today we're going to start to explore gradients in Photoshop. We'll be learning about the kinds of gradients available and about the buttons on the Options command bar, which is this thing that's here at the top of the window. You'll find the gradient tool in the toolbar grouped with the paint bucket right over there. You can also get it by tapping G on the keyboard or Shift G if the paint bucket happens to be on the top. Of course, as soon as you get the tool, the options bar up here will change to show the options for that particular tool. So to the left, like always, you have the preset button. We're not going to get into that. I'll do that some other time. Directly to the right of that is the swatch, which shows you which gradient you currently have available and what the beginning and ending colors of that gradient will be. It also has a little button that lets you choose more gradients. We'll come back to this later. This is the really interesting part of this particular tool. The next thing are 5 little buttons that show you the kinds of gradients that are available. Each button actually is a thumbnail of the way that gradient behaves, so it's easy to tell which is which. The first one is the linear gradient. A linear gradient starts with a color on the left side of the swatch when you click the mouse button. The drag will determine the scale and the direction of the gradient. The direction will be perpendicular to the angle of the drag, and where you release the mouse button will be the last color that's in the gradient. So anything before the click will be the color that's to the left of the gradient, and anything that is after the click will be the color that's on the right-hand side of the gradient. So if I drag from left to right like I did, I'll get blue on the left and green on the right. And if I drag from right to left, then I'll get blue on the right and green on the left in this particular gradient, because of course here blue is on the left and green is on the right. And you can just make whatever length you want in whatever direction you want. The next one is the radial gradient. For that one, the gradient begins with a color on the left when you click, but the drag only determines the scale because there's no direction in a circle, which of course is what the radial gradient is. So anything after you release the mouse button will become the color that's on the right-hand side of the gradient. You can make the circles as large or as small as you want, and that's what the scale is all about. The next one is the angle gradient. Now this is an interesting one. You can think of it as the gradient wrapped around a cone and seen from the top. Clicking determines where the point of the cone is. And as you drag, that determines the angle of the seam between the first and the last color on the gradient. When you let go, the color that is on the left-hand side will always be the first color clockwise on the direction that you dragged, and then the rest of the gradient will be arranged around that clockwise, ending with a color that's on the right-hand side of the swatch. There's no scale to this one. It really doesn't matter how tiny you make your drag, because this will always fill the entire image, and the size of the drag doesn't matter. It's just the direction that makes a difference. Then we have the reflected gradient. Now this one is like the linear, except that the point where you make the initial mouse click turns out to be the middle of the gradient. And you only have that color that's on the left in this one little fine stripe. And the color that's on the right will be on both sides of the gradient because it's reflected. So that's the way that one works. And finally, we have the diamond gradient, which is like the radial, except instead of being a circle, it's a square, and the colors are kind of pulled out just a little bit at the corners. So where you first click determines the center of the square, the drag determines the direction and the angle, and where you let go of the mouse button, you'll have one of the corners of the square. So if you want to make this one into a perfect diamond, or a perfect square, you can hold down the Shift key and that will constrain your drag so you get what you want, or you can just have just any old thing. Now with all of them, of course, you can drag out way beyond the border of the image, and then you will lose the colors that are on the right-hand side of your gradient. And you can also start way outside the image, and then you won't have the colors that are on the left-hand side of your gradient. And you can do both and lose the colors that are on both sides of your gradients if you feel so inclined. The next section holds the blending mode button and the opacity sliders. Now, you can change the blending mode before you start dragging out your gradient. You have to do everything before you start dragging out the gradients, but say you can change it to screen, and then when you make your gradient, it will apply it using the screen blending mode and whatever opacity you have chosen to the very same layer that you're already working on. I'm going to undo that. I suggest that you never use these particular things, that you just leave this set at normal and leave the opacity set at 100%, make all of your gradients on separate layers, and then you can use the regular blending mode button and opacity slider over here in the layer panel, and you'll have a whole lot more control, and you can tweak it on the fly as you go. You don't have to set it up ahead of time. So that's just my recommendation. The final section contains these 3 checkboxes. The first one is the reverse checkbox, and as you might imagine, that reverses the direction of the gradient, so that what was on the left is on the right, and vice versa. If I were to use this now, I would have a little green dot in the middle, and the area outside would be blue with this particular gradient. So that's really fairly easy and self-explanatory. The dither button is something that will reduce the possibility of banding, which is possible if your colors are too close together and your scale is too large. You're really not likely to ever see it, but you can safely just leave this little checkbox checked just in case. And finally, you have the transparency. Now, I'm going to make a new layer so that you can see this more easily. Transparency is one of the attributes that you can choose for a gradient. So I'm going to change my gradient to one that I've made for this tutorial. I have the foreground color here on the left and the background color on the right, and in between I have these bars of transparency, which you can tell by the checkerboard pattern that you're used to seeing to show transparency pretty much everywhere in Photoshop. And when I use this, I will get the gradient with the transparency, which makes stripes. In this particular case, because I'm still using the diamond gradient, I have a little diamond, or I could have a little square. The transparency is there and it looks really cool. If I disable the transparency, and you look in the swatch, you can see that those little transparent bars have vanished. And if I make a new gradient here in the window, you'll see that now it's just a plain foreground to background gradient with no transparency left. So generally speaking, you'll want to leave that on, because if there's transparency in a gradient, you'll want it enabled. But just in case you don't, you can disable that and then you won't have it anymore. And that's about that for that part. So that leaves us with a really interesting part, which is the swatch itself. And this is where you can choose your gradients, and you can actually edit gradients and make new gradients and do all kinds of fine stuff, which I'm dying to show you, but we are out of time, so it will have to be next time. Until then, this has been Robin Wood, and I hope that you found this helpful.